Han Atebashte, welcome. My name is Stefanie Gillson. I am Dakota Mid-Wacaton Sioux. I'm going to do a brief land acknowledgement to get us started today. Land acknowledgements do not exist in the past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current and ongoing process. It is important to understand the longstanding history as well to seek our place within it. Since today we are also Yale Grand Rounds as well as the Yale Women's Mental Health Conference, we are going to discuss the Indigenous people who steward this lands for thousands of people prior to colonization. This includes Mohegan, Mashtaq Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Shannecoke, Golden Hill, Passamaquoddy, Niantic, Quinnipiac, and other Algonquin-speaking nations, some of who are still here in what is more commonly called Connecticut. We honor and respect this enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and land. As Indigenous people, land is part of who we are. It is a mixture of our blood, our past, current, and future. I will stick a website in the chat. Please take a look at whose land you are on, but also recognize that land acknowledgements are not enough. Please consider supporting Indigenous communities by donating your time and money, supporting grassroots organizations, as well as commitment to returning the land. I will now turn it over to Dr. John Crystal, who will briefly introduce the next speakers and is also the chair of the Department of Psychiatry here at Yale.
Stefanie, thanks so much for that introduction and for those meaningful words. It's my honor to welcome you to the second annual Women's Mental Health Conference at Yale, founded by two of our psychiatry residents, Dr. Sofia Noori and Dr. Stefanie Gillson. Last year, over 450 attendees came for the first conference, where V, formerly known as Eve Ensler, gave the keynote. Last year's keynote and grand rounds were incredibly inspiring. The energy and inspiration of that conference has obviously created a very special momentum. Last year, we had over 450 attendees. This year, we have over 1,000 people who have registered. This is amazing. It's incredible. And I want to congratulate the student and trainee-run committee that have organized these conferences. As they have developed, the Women's Mental Health Conferences have brought awareness to women's mental health and the intersection of racism, historical trauma, and the current pandemic. At the conference last year, the question I heard most commonly asked of me was, where are the men? I hope that we are here in greater numbers this year, because while this conference is about women's mental health, it is ultimately for all of us. There is no mental health in our society without women's mental health. For this special Grand Rounds, we are proud to be host to a conversation between a member of our psychiatric community, Dr. Carmen Black, and the founder of the Me Too movement, Ms. Tarana Burke. Both Dr. Black and Ms. Burke have been incredible advocates for their communities and for those whose stories go unheard. So please join me in welcoming the conference co-chairs, Drs. Noori and Gillson, for their introductions to the conference and to Dr. Black. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Crystal. Sophia and I are really honored to be here with you all today on our second annual Women's Mental Health Conference. And we could not have done any of this without our extremely dedicated trainees and students who have been working countless hours for months to make this conference happen. They have been tailored, the talks that we will be having, including on missing and murdered Indigenous women, Asian American discrimination, reproductive justice, and of course, this talk that we are about to witness today. We are also so grateful to our supporters, including the Yale School of Medicine, specifically Dean Lattimore's office and his staff, Yale New Haven Hospital, the Yale Department of Psychiatry, Yale Department of Medicine, the Native American Cultural Center at Yale, and Ken and Susan Fellows, Miigwech, Pidamadedo to all of you, and I'll pass it off to Dr. Sofia Noori.
Hi, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce you all to Dr. Carmen Black. I know Dr. Black in many different contexts, as a clinical supervisor, a mentor, and as a friend. Dr. Black first came to Yale 2 years ago by way of the Medical College of Georgia and was born and raised in the Peach State in Augusta, Georgia. She's one of only a handful of rising Black faculty in psychiatry. Although 13% of Americans identify as Black, only 2.6% of doctors are Black women. In psychiatry, the statistic is even a little worse. Less than 2% are Black women. I was fortunate enough to be Dr. Black's first resident when she was hired here at Yale. She helped me become a better prescriber, a better therapist, and just an overall better doctor. Dr. Black's wisdom comes from her own lived experience with asymmetric systems of power, both in and outside of medicine. She has lived through the unfortunately common experience of bias in medical education that many minoritized trainees entering the ivory tower of medicine also experience. Although she survived, she continues to dedicate her career to reducing bias and excessive force in psychiatric settings. She's a widely published expert on the elimination of police and security forces in psychiatric emergencies. We specifically invited Dr. Black to share the space with Tarana Burke because both of these remarkable women center the stories of those who so often go unheard by most of society. Dr. Black relentlessly advocates for mental health patients in crisis to receive the most humane care possible, and Ms. Burke fights a constant battle against the erasure of sexual assault survivors, especially Black and Brown survivors, in the public eye. We are so incredibly grateful to the Yale Department of Psychiatry as well for giving us this space and cross-listing the event for grand rounds in such an elite academic institution so that we could center this conversation between two agents of change. Thank you so much. And now for Dr. Black.
Dr. Noori, I'm so glad you were my first resident because it just made this, raise a roof, there you go, because you made the experience so much better. So good morning, I'm Dr. Carmen Black, and I'm thrilled to be here having this honor and privilege to introduce Tarana Burke to you this morning. Tarana Burke is a world-renowned activist, community organizer, and executive. Born in the Bronx, she attended Alabama State University, a historically Black university. She has organized numerous initiatives addressing police brutality, housing inequality, economic justice, and perhaps most famously, sexual assault prevention. In 2006, she founded the Me Too movement in Selma, Alabama, to serve the underprivileged Black girls and women there for whom more traditional avenues of social and mental health healing were failing to serve. As a survivor herself, she worked tirelessly to serve these wonderful Black women using the Me Too movement for over a decade before ever being recognized by mainstream media. Starting in 2017, the world began to see her as the face of the Me Too movement. Following this global movement, Tarana founded the Me Too International nonprofit organization, for which she was named the 2017 Time Person of the Year. Today, #MeToo has been expanded to advocate for survivors of sexual assault of all ages, races, ethnicities, genders, nationalities, and backgrounds. Her many achievements include the 2019 Sydney Peace Prize and Harvard Gleitzman Citizen Activist Award. I could speak for hours regarding Tarana Burke's many achievements. Many were done in the spotlight, but many have been done one-to-one, person-to-person, Black woman to Black woman, without the spotlight ever shining on these works. You see, spotlights can be fickle things. Spotlights exist in the eye of the beholder. Although the silence breakers of the Me Too movement were named the 2017 Time Person of the Year, many of you may not have recognized that Tarana's proud Black face was deemed unworthy to grace the cover of the Time magazine, spotlighting her very own work. She was erased from the cover, honoring the movement that she herself had created over a decade ago to help the survivors of underserved Alabama. Instead, the cover pictured 5 women, none of them being Tarana, with the caption that, ironically, read, "The voices that launched a movement." Perhaps as an extension of this erasure, many now mistakenly identify the #MeToo movement as an organization of powerful women holding powerful men accountable. Indeed, the first lines of the Time article were, and I quote, "Movie stars are supposedly nothing like you and me. They're svelte, glamorous, self-possessed. They wear dresses we can't afford and live in houses we can only dream of." Yes, absolutely, we are a unified body of survivors. But the spotlight of this award was not focused on Tarana Burke, and it certainly was not focused on the beautiful Black community in Selma, Alabama. The body of media moguls and magazine editors who decide who is on the cover of the magazine and who gets the attention of the first sentence is painfully lacking diverse representation. As you heard in the heartwarming introduction by Dr. Noori, Black women like myself only represent 2% of all academic medical faculty. We are 2%, like chocolate milk, my friends. Like the media, medicine was founded on structures that intentionally and actively excluded diverse representation amongst stakeholders, and therefore spotlighted that which advanced their own agenda. Personally speaking, to have survived to be your faculty moderator today, I first had to endure being remediated as the only Black categorical resident to attend this program in 5 years. I was remediated for being clinically incompetent, unprofessional if I disagreed or showed any emotional reaction, and insubordinate if I didn't comply with the discrimination. I swore that if I made it out of there with my head held high and my shoulders squared, I would never again let my voice be silenced. Thank you to the Medical College of Georgia and Yale University for being the academic home to my voice. But I suppose I am insubordinate because within 5 months of being your faculty member here, I had police called on me when my child was cast as a slave in her school play, and they protested a little bit too loudly, and police were called to suppress our discontent. That's Black in medicine, and that's what it has taken for me to be here with you today. Diverse representation was also missing when mental health insurance systems were built, when psychiatric diagnoses were crafted, when psychological therapies were developed, and when armed police were first inserted into the management, not care, management of mental health crises. Indeed, disparities literature tells us again and again that medicine is 2 to 4 times more likely to view our Black community as being psychotic instead of being depressed or having PTSD in the instances that we do seek healing for our mental health struggles. Yes, medicine will diagnose us as psychotic and paranoid when we as Black survivors do not trust this system that was not designed for our well-being to begin with. Tarana, for the next 45 minutes, there is none more privileged than Black survivors in this elitist, historically exclusionary academic space. Let us use this power and privilege to disseminate the needs of our community, the Black community, without filtration, without shame, without apology, without flinching, and without code switching. Because in this moment, we are Black excellence, and there is no spotlight mightier than our own, and no one's gaze upon us to whom we must cater, except that of ourselves and our community. Help us use this spotlight to lift up and recenter the voices and narratives of those who are too often left behind, too often erased, too often forgotten. Help me hold mental health systems accountable to Black women survivors. To all here today, I present to you the phenomenal Tarana Burke. Tarana, welcome. Please speak your truth for all who are here today. Thank you.
Well, hi. That was quite an introduction. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here today. I had a lovely pre-meeting to kind of get warmed up. And so I have, I guess, an idea of who's in the audience. And now I have a really great idea of who the moderator is. So let's jump right in.
Well, thank you. Tell us more about the heart of the origin of the Me Too movement and the advocacy you created to meet the needs of Black women.
So the work I started with was actually with Black girls. This work started because I was in a community, and I was just talking about this in the last session. I was in a community that, although it was largely Black, and the school that I was working in with the young people and the schools they came from were largely run by Black administrators, there was still a way in which our young people showed up with what I could readily identify as trauma, and it was labeled as something else. And so, we already had a habit of when we came into the schools with our program, I would speak with the guidance counselor and say, give me your girls who have been suspended several times. Give me the girls who are who are constantly on a detention list. Like, those are the girls I want. I don't. Sometimes when you show up and you do leadership development, the tendency is to go get, all the perfect attendance kids and all the kids who are in the honors program. And I think they're doing okay. And so our programs before we even dealt with sexual violence, our leadership program focused on that population of students. And then when the students came together and we were, in sessions and what have you, there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of attitude, but that a lot of times Black girls' anger and attitude just gets dismissed as inherent, right? Of course you are angry and attitudinal. You are, young Black girl from the hood. And nobody ever unpacks that in any way. And so our children get suspended more and disciplined more and over-disciplined before anybody says something is wrong, right? And so we wanted to deal with that. But what I was not ready for and didn't understand at the time was where the roots of those traumas. And the more we spent time with the girls, the more that we created, trust between them, the more these stories started to come out. And they were, so many of them were related to violence in general, but a lot of it was sexual violence. And as a survivor, I was simultaneously grappling with my own stuff, trying to figure out why I had, the feelings that I had. And I recognized the anger and the rage that I saw in these girls is the same kind that I had held when I was that age. And it just felt like I need to do something, right? I was on this quest, I was reading books, and I had just recently discovered that I was a survivor, not a victim, as identified by this group of community women. And I was starting to feel alive in a way that I had not felt before. And it felt a little, I don't know what the right word is, but I felt bad being poured into and finding ways to pour into myself, and then going into a community where nobody was pouring into these girls. Nobody was saying healing was possible. Nobody was saying this is not your fault. Just really baseline things that I was starting to get. And it didn't cost anything, right? It didn't cost anything to do that. It didn't cost any, you have to build a program around it and get a grant and funding and have a bunch of meetings to gather a group of girls together and say, you matter. And I see you, and I want, and your stories are valid and your experiences are valid. So a lot of it came from that. I did not really know what I was doing. I just knew, that I wanted to feel better. I knew I wanted to make them feel better. And as the story started unfolding and I realized that the roots of their feelings came from the similar places as mine, I was like, we have to do something specific. Leadership development is not going to help. Leadership development alone, right? We'll just have really well-developed, traumatized children going into the world, which is what I was. And I didn't want them to get to be 25 and 26 or 30 years old and realizing, oh, I did really well in life. I got good grades and I graduated and I did this and that, but I still feel fundamentally broken on the inside. I feel like something's wrong with me. And I thought, what would have changed the trajectory of my life at 12 or 13 if somebody had just seen me and said, why are you so angry? Why aren't you, Why are you performing? If somebody had seen through the performance that I was given, and I was, particularly at that age, I didn't get angry really till high school, but in middle school, it was all performance, and nobody could see through that. Nobody could see that this wasn't a real thing. And I think it's because nobody cared to see. So that was sort of the roots of it. It was like, I'm an organizer. I know I'm an organizer. Community organizing was in my heart, and it was what I intended to do with my life. And we organized around everything, and I would see there would be police brutality in the community. There would be, police using excessive force. There would be children who were shot in our community, and we had rapid response. Community meeting tonight, we need to discuss this. What is our response going to be? If a child is shot in our community, we come to, and you see this over and over again in communities across the country. A young person experiences some kind of violence. So there's a child shot in the community. We get T-shirts printed up, we get community meetings going, we get fish fries going to raise money. Right. We rally, and we rally because we feel connected to that violence. We feel connected to the child, we feel connected to community, and we understand that violence, and we don't want that violence to prevail in the places that we live. That if that child can be shot, my child can be shot. If this violence can come into the community, it can affect my life. I don't want to live in a space where I feel scared to walk down the street or scared to come out of my home. And so all of those things make sense to us. we definitely rally when there's gun violence, right? When there's sexual violence, it's an opposite reaction. When it's sexual violence, the community doesn't feel responsible for that violence. When there's gun violence, the community feels responsible and says, we have to do something about this violence. When there's sexual violence, it says, we don't really know what happened. We don't want to upend somebody's life because this child said, because of these accusations. This is a good person, right? And so the story is different. The rallying is non-existent. And I watched these contradictions happen. How could I sit in a classroom where 75% of the students in my classroom, then this is just my estimation, at least 75% of the students in my classroom have had some experience with sexual violence, and 100% of the children in that classroom come from this community. And I've made a commitment to this community, and I've made a commitment to these children. So what do I owe these students in my classroom? I owe them something. We owe them something. And so that's the heart of it, right? Is that if you really believe in community and you feel connected to community, particularly as an organizer, or if you have made any kind of commitment to your community, then that includes the entire community. And it includes a wide breadth of issue areas, including sexual violence. And sexual violence is so pervasive that it takes a collective response. Mm-hmm. And what I find is that we individualize it, right? Oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you. What do you need? You need to go to the Rape Crisis Center, or you need to get some therapy, or you need to handle this yourself. And
it's like othering.
It's very much othering. It's very much othering. When people experience sexual violence, and this is, I think, largely across the board, it's very individualized. I'm sorry that happened to you. So there's some distance there, right? And here, take a pamphlet, go see this clinic, call this number, you do all of these things. And then we are absent of responsibility in what happened to that person and what happens after. So that's why it had to be a movement.
Mm-hmm. And in your experience, when someone gets that pamphlet, even if they took the initiative to go find the healing, this traditional center, mm-hmm. How do you feel? Like, you were so inspired by the lack of appropriateness in these systems that you created your own movement. So what were you seeing when survivors did go seek help in these traditional systems?
You know, I had an experience, a very specific experience in Alabama. And I have seen it, and every time I tell this story, I get another story back or more stories back from people. There's only one rape crisis center. It's a small city. And because I felt like I didn't know what I was doing, I wasn't trained. And I literally, my feelings, I'm not a therapist, right? I'm not trained in this. I'm not a psychologist. I don't have the academic background for certain and I don't have the whatever dexterity you need to handle what I was dealing with. And so I went to seek help, and I went to the Rape Crisis Center, and I was told by the one older white woman who came to answer the door that they don't take walk-ins. Now you have to know that Selma, Alabama is a city of about 24,000 people. It is predominantly Black. It is in one of the poorest counties in not just Alabama, but in the country. Dallas County is one of the poorest counties in the country. And what she said to me was, in order to be seen or assisted at the Rape Crisis Center, you had to go to the police, file a report, and then the police would refer you back to them. So they only took referrals. And I remember, and I just wrote about this in my memoir, but I remember sitting in my car afterwards feeling enraged at first, but also knowing that none of my children would do this. I didn't know an adult who would do that, right? I didn't know a single adult Black woman who would go through that process willingly and then go be referred to this clinic. But also, what kind of space is this? This is a professional space that I'm coming to, and she wouldn't even let me in the door. She wouldn't let me in the door. She stood with her physical body in the door to prevent me from coming in, and gave me a pamphlet after I asked her. So, you know, that had certainly been my experience. At another point, I purposefully sought out a person of color when I was pregnant as an OBGYN. And so I had a Dominican male doctor who happened to be from the Bronx. I was very excited about that because I was in Alabama. And I confided in him about my experience, and he gave me the phone number of a therapist. I never even really tell this story, but he gave me the phone number of a therapist. I had never been to therapy in my life. And it still had a lot of stigma for me as just a young Black woman. I just was like, I'm not crazy, that kind of thing. And I said, he was wonderful. He encouraged me. He gave me a couple of numbers, and I called them, and I had an intake with this young white woman who, asked me, I guess, whatever the normal questions are. And then at some point she said, well, Dr. Pena said that you had experienced some sexual assault. And I said, yes. And she was like, well, tell me about that. I was like, no. Are you crazy? And I was like, nah, I don't want to talk about it.
Really voyeuristic. Tell me all your deepest pain. You don't know me from Bob.
I met you 7 minutes ago, right? And I said, I don't know what to say, right? I had never talked about this in a clinical situation. And she put her little notepad down and said, well, honey, if you're not gonna be able to talk about it, we're not gonna be able to help you. And I was like, cool, no problem. And I left. And I was 23, right? Because I had my daughter at 23. So I was 23. I did not go back and seek therapy until I was 33. Because that is what it was in my mind, is what my experience was going to be. And so, yeah, I have heard just too many stories of women, Black women in particular, who had to just push through to get therapy, to find and to seek out and to do all of this searching. And then it's not like you can Google, I want a Black therapist. Now you can, but that wasn't the case back then. And so, yeah, that was another.
You're in short supply, my friend.
Oh, I know. I mean, I wish they would make a real clear database, but that's another story.
That'll be next year.
But I will say that one of the reasons why I started doing the work the way I did it was because of those experiences. So I knew we started community healing circles because I was really clear that our folks were not going to seek out therapy. And you call these hotlines, and that could be a whole other. I've had folks who called hotlines and encountered people who were religious, like right-wing religious folks who tried to talk them out of it. I've had talks about what happened to them. I've had people who were given numbers that don't work. Like the hotline thing is just not reliable all the time as well. So knowing that our folks are not going to use some of these avenues that already exist, we started doing community healing circles. And it was and because I was nervous about like re-traumatizing people and all of that, it wasn't a space that was created to dig into the roots of what happened to people. It was a space that was created for us to feel normal, for us to come together and say things like, oh, you're scared of the dark? I'm scared of the dark too. Oh, I didn't know other people felt that way, for us to share what survival felt like, and what survival was doing to us, and how we were surviving and coping. And that was just desperately needed.
Thank you for sharing that. It sounds like you raised several significant barriers, because I want to be mindful that we're speaking to the mental health audience, and some takeaway points of what you just said to the mental health audience. It sounds like the front door is a huge barrier to survivors getting help. Just that experience, you've already gotten in your car, you've already taken the bus, you've already walked to the center, you're already anxious all the way up there. And then the receptivity of your first moments are crucial if we're ever going to get that healing. Is that a correct reflection of what you said?
Yeah, I think that feels like a correct reflection, yeah.
So what have you seen improve, if anything, about the first receptivity for Black survivors? Has anything become better across the years?
Yeah, I think it has. I think one, we have had a surge in Black women and other folks of color joining the ranks of in therapy. You can find a Black therapist. You can find, services. You have things like Therapy for Black Girls and some of the other national networks that exist that are. You can find a queer. My daughter is queer, and we very specifically wanted a queer person of color therapist for them, and I was able to find that. Right, things like that you definitely couldn't do even 10 years ago. It was hard to find. It feels like the line is loosening a bit, and that's one big thing. When I was in the session earlier and I was listening to some of the young people there talk about the specific areas of this work that they want to tackle, those are so important that we have, because the other thing is that sometimes we're not just looking for a Black therapist, right? Like in the case of my daughter, I need somebody who understands LGBTQIA issues. I need somebody who will use right pronouns and won't misgender me in the middle of my session. I need somebody who deals with young people. Like there's some nuances that need to be, if you really understand the fullness and see us as human beings, then you understand that just because you're a Black therapist doesn't mean that you're somebody who meets the needs of all Black people. And whatever other cultural, whether you're like Southeast Asian therapist, right? If you are Southeast Asian therapist who still holds on to a lot of the traditions that have been harmful to a lot of young people, that's not going to help. You're just going to reinforce those things. So I think what's changed in the last decade at least is that we've seen just more, not just more people, but more nuance and more people really drilling down to specific areas, which is super helpful.
That's awesome. Thank you. And I also want to speak more. You talked a lot about a lot of your advocacy is around policing. You talked about how when they referred you to go make a report to the police, that was a major barrier towards seeking further healing. And so I want to take a moment to talk about Black communities and a very complicated mental health social dynamic with police.
Yeah.
Now, many, if not most, perpetrators are known to the victim. Is it many or most?
I would say many.
Many.
Most. Yes.
So it's difficult for people to report their family members, especially if they're dependent on them. And in Black communities, this problem is further compounded because we have a history of our Black men being accused of sexual assault. Anyone who needs to go educate themselves can refer to Emmett Till. Now, our Black men are at risk of being murdered by police for the mere fact that they exist as a Black body instead of white. Again, turn on the TV to educate yourselves for those who need more info. So this is the cultural context that Black women survivors find themselves when weighing decisions of what to do for their safety. How do you feel this complex history influences the cultural perception and dynamic of sexual violence in Black communities?
It's so complicated on the one hand, but it's also not on the other, right? Even listening to how you frame that just now, we frame police violence as something that men deal with and sexual violence as something that women deal with, as opposed to understanding. A part of it is about information and what how the narrative has shaped. And yes, the easy and straightforward answer is yes. It is absolutely an issue in our community, and it's an issue that has stifled so many Black women and women identified folk from coming forward, from making complicated, it's not even just family sometimes. It could be your homeboy, right? That you thought was a friend and then turned on you. And we still don't want to engage the police. We still there's these layers. Almost everybody who deals with sexual violence is dealing with immediate shame and guilt. Like, I did something to cause this, right? That kind of happens irrespective of race. But if you understand that shame is also a tool of white supremacy, there is additional shame that is heaped on you for the intersections that we show up with the identities that we show up with. I am Black, I am a woman, I'm from such and such a place, I do such and such a job. And so all of those things are taken into account when we're thinking about, what do I do with this, right? So yes, that's complicated. But we have to, in order to sort of unpack and attack and dismantle that, the blob there that exists because of that. We have to talk about it differently. We have to be honest about and clear about what the statistics are. There is an undeniable, long, horrific history of Black men of sexual violence being used as a tool against Black men, right? Being weaponized against Black men in this country. Yes, we have from Emmett Till to the Central Park Five. We have seen the stories over and over and over again. In most of those cases, in many of those cases, it's a white woman involved, right? I said in this last session, we are socialized to respond to the vulnerability of white women in this country. And because that's true, and that's whether white women want us to or not, right? Because white men want to come in and be heroes for them. So because of that, if a white woman says so, it has to be so. That's been the history and the case in the country for a long time. We recognize that when we talk about these cases, we always bring up Emmett Till. We always have these big cases to refer to. We don't talk about how sexual violence has been weaponized against Black women since we were enslaved in this country, right?
What's more?
We don't go into the roots of sexual violence and the hypersexualization of Black women as enslaved individuals in this country. So the horrific history that exists of sexual violence being weaponized against Black men is right alongside the horrific history that exists of sexual violence being weaponized against Black women. And indeed, because of that history, we are at the reality of Black women in this country is that we have the second highest rate of sexual violence behind Indigenous women who people actually just try to erase, right? We just don't even talk about them. That's another whole other conversation. But I will say that what's unique, the unique difference between number one and number two is that in Indigenous communities, they still unfortunately have this distinction where they have the highest rate of people coming from outside of their community into the community committing this violence, right? So you have these stories, we've heard the stories of missing and murdered Indigenous women. We don't hear enough about these raids and rides. And I did a lot of work in the Southwest, in Arizona and New Mexico, where white boys on Friday and Saturday nights would ride through reservations and snatch Native and Indigenous girls up and sexually assault them, knowing that when they come off the reservation because of the sovereign laws, they can't be touched, right? There's all these kind of issues that happen around Indigenous folks that this is not a conversation, including police brutality. Mm-hmm. But you move to number two, Black women, and on down, right? It's not just the Black community. A lot of that violence is intracommunal. A lot of that is happening inside of our community. And because of what we just started talking about earlier, because of us knowing our perpetrator, because of the history of violence against Black men, because we see a hashtag every week of another Black man being murdered at the hands of police or what have you, there is a pause that we have built in that says, I can't add with my little bit of shame and trauma. I don't want to add to another Black man going to jail. I don't want to add. And fine, right? We know that we want to move away from carceral solutions in general. So fine that you don't want to do that, but then what is there to do? We don't have alternative solutions. What do you do, right? And it has become a situation that I think it is dire. I think it's a dire situation right now. If we don't make a real change and amplify the voices of Black and brown women who are coming forward, because there's a whole other set of situations. Like you go into Latinx community and you have people who are scared, women in particular, who are scared to come forward, children, because you coming forward could mean your family being deported. Mm-hmm. You know, you have Latinx folks and folks from the AAPI community who come from these big interconnected families, right? Where you saying something can bring down a whole family, can cause the kind of complications in the family that the survivor doesn't want to be responsible for. And so I'm saying all of this to say, I wish there was just more focus on the nuances of survival based on culture and ethnicity and race. The effects of the violence are largely similar, right? The trauma that we hold is largely similar, how we show up and what happens after. But how we got there is so very, very different. We can have a room full of survivors, all Black women, and Black Caribbean, Black coming from the continent, Black raised in the South, Black from the city. And we have all different reasons why we didn't tell, cultural reasons why we didn't tell, and we get kind of lumped together. You can do the same thing with these various communities. And if we don't start just aggregating and extracting some of that information to really understand, then we won't really be successful in trying to dismantle the violence. And I know we started off talking about why Black women don't tell, but this is all part of it, right? Like, absolutely. It's all part of why we don't come forward. The cultural part is really, really significant.
What are your ideas of transformational justice and moving away from the carceral system? I'm gonna get my Starbucks, hold on.
Excuse me, I couldn't find a smaller bottle. I'm like, I ran to get a bottle of water. I'm like, so you brought me 54 ounces, thank you.
You can be thirsty, that's all right. Look, you've been talking for 2 hours, we're good.
But so I get, I call myself a student of abolition at this point, right? Because I think a lot of people, we jump on bandwagons really quickly. And so lots of folks who were one thing at one point are now calling themselves abolitionists. And I think before I can say that wholeheartedly, I need to know more and study more and understand more. And I understand a lot, by the way, right? But I guess where I find myself in the last 4 years in particular, it was easy for me to identify before I was in this sort of spotlight. But what has happened is that Me Too has come to represent a larger, like all survivors. And all survivors aren't in the same place. So while I believe in abolition, and I believe that we should move away from carceral justice, just because it doesn't work. It's just not, there's so much evidence that it doesn't work. I also know that I'm not going to rally against the women who want to see their rape kits tested, right? And it has come down to almost a fight. There's this conflict between the two schools of thought. And so I've seen where people who have said, those rape kit testings are just going to move more people into a carceral system, and so that shouldn't be a part of the movement to end sexual violence. And so how can I call myself a leader, or even be empathetic towards survivors, and tell people that the only form of justice, whether we know it works or not, but the only form of justice you've been introduced to, we've been raised to believe that if you're assaulted, you go to the police, you file a report, you get this test done. What else is there that exists? Nothing yet. So I'm a believer in the fact, in that we have to dream of a different way forward. We have to, and not just dream, right? Not just a bunch of heady people sitting in a room talking about what transformation would look like, and transformative justice is the way to go, and shaming people who don't embrace the idea of transformative and restorative justice.
Sounds like you don't want armchair warriors.
Right, like we can't just be that. I think that we have to, especially in spaces like Yale and on college campuses where they have resources, we should start actively incubating some of these ideas. We can do it in spaces like that. What does it look like to have a program that's about transformative justice on campus? So that when the people who we want to shift those ideas come and say, well, what else is there? We can say, well, we've piloted this, we've tried this. We are moving in that direction actively. But while we're moving in that direction, we still have to find space for the people who are looking for something right now. And so that's why I say I'm a student, because I want to move people into a new vision, but until we have that vision in place, until we have that thing in place, we have to offer them something. And so that's why, you know, it sounds wishy-washy to people, but it's somewhere between reform and revolution, you know? Like the systems that we have don't work. And so there are people who are committed to changing those systems, even though they don't work, and we probably need to abolish them and create new systems. But I don't think those people aren't my people. You understand what I'm trying to say, right? I think that if today you come to me and say you were sexually assaulted, I don't think that you want to hear about my vision for transformation years to come. I think you want a solution right now. And so I have to represent both of those schools. I can't abandon one for the other when all of the people are in need of a response. So I believe in it. I'm actively working towards it. I've worked with groups of people who are thinking about what that could look like and thinking about ways to pilot those kind of programs. And at the same time, I want to still be a voice and an advocate for those who aren't there yet.
Sounds like balancing the best of what is with a vision for what could and should be, and having to live that duality in the moment.
Yeah.
And I can only speak for myself, but as a Black woman functioning in some of these elitist spaces that you just mentioned, the think tanks, the spaces where we like to flout ourselves in these spaces where revolutionaries are trained and all that fun stuff. But at times I feel a disconnect between publicized platforms of change and publicized banners of anti-racism and a disconnect between the tangible organizational change as a result of forums like these. It's a lot of talk and banners, but I want to know what we're doing. So if you had, in our last about 5-10 minutes together, if you had one tangible ask of Yale University Department of Psychiatry, you won't give me a microphone, no time get soon, so we gonna ask it. If you had one explicit, achievable item of accountability that you would wish you could pop your head in 6 months and say, yes, we have listened to your words and implemented something, what would you want the one item of change to be?
Well, I mean, I guess for the School of Psychiatry, since you are training the best and the brightest, right? You come out of a Yale School of Psychiatry, you're almost guaranteed to have a flourishing career, if you will. I wish that, well, I wish I had prepared a better answer, but what comes to mind for me is that we were just talking about some of the nuance and the niche areas that people need to explore. It would be wonderful for places that have the resources like Yale to make that more readily accessible, so that when you come into the school in year one or however it works, that you have just a plethora of expertise available, which means they have to go outside of the faculty and staff that they have and maybe bring in some experts or bring in at least guest lecturers to talk about what's possible. It would be really wonderful to have, you know, folks entering Yale School of Psychiatry who are not quite sure, you know, you want to get in psychiatry, but you're not quite sure what you want to tackle, to be able to speak to somebody who's like, well, I deal specifically with transitioning trans teenagers who are whatever, right? Like, or I deal specifically with elder Black folks who were traumatized in their youth and had no access to psychiatric care or therapeutic care around their trauma. Like, there's so much nuance that's needed, and it would be wonderful for a school like Yale to set the example of how, one, to validate that those things are needed, and to help spread the field of psychiatry a little bit wider, so that people have, or maybe have multiple areas, right? They can have a list. So when I go, what I want to do is when I go on the website to find a psychiatrist or to find psychiatric help, I want to see a list of things that say, I deal with these little cracks and crevices that sometimes get overlooked. So I think that would be helpful, outside of also recruiting, you know, diversity and recruiting, which probably people think is like low hanging fruit, and it is, but people still walk by low hanging fruit, right? It's right there and they don't pick it. So just because it's low hanging doesn't mean it's being actually picked. And it would be wonderful to see some vigorous recruitment of diverse populations. And to your point about being remediated when you came in to the program, right? To removing some of those barriers and understanding the cultural context that we come from. And not just like, I've when you said that, it kind of stuck with me, because I remember when my cousin was going to medical school, and all of a sudden they had been a stellar, honors, all kind of awards and carrying on their whole life. And now all of a sudden they were at, what's the school in the South? I don't want to name school. Anyway, you know, a medical school in the South. And it wasn't enough, right? And the only reason we could come up with was color their skin.
Correct.
So yeah, I think those are some tangible things that come to mind right away.
I've personally chosen to use my remediation just to broadcast how much nonsense there is. The idea of like othering, or it doesn't happen here, or, well, it's not you being Black, it's just that you suck, right? No, it's not your skin. It's just you can't just by yourself. Yeah, no, gaslight. No. We love Black folks. You just need to repeat the course, type of thing. So, and what I hear you saying for a training perspective is incorporating expertise beyond the MD, PhD, classically trained, because there are so many 400 years of barriers preventing us from achieving those milestones. Honoring the lived experience, honoring the expertise of survivors, honoring and creating space for them to speak their truth. Is that an accurate reflection, or tell me more?
Yes, and I think it's honoring the expertise of survivors, but also if you listen to and understand the breadth of survival, then you can pull out the needs that you see. We focus a lot, and I think just society in general focuses on a lot at the point of trauma. Right? This thing happened to you and now you are traumatized and these are all the results. But it's compounded trauma, right? For some of us, it is the thing that happened to us, and then it is the things that happened after what happened to us that has really brought us to, that gave us the PTSD and the you know, the kind of trauma that we're carrying. And so if we would look at the breadth of survival and how it affects. So again, I talked about how some Black girls hold trauma. I was both of those girls. I was the Black girl who held trauma, being angry and lashing out and fighting. But before that, I was the Black girl who was a perfectionist, who wanted to be perfect, who wanted to please everybody, who wanted to be seen as a good girl, right? And we need more training to recognize how trauma, but also survival impacts different communities. They're not going to all show up cutting and being despondent and sitting in the corner and not washing up. And like, I don't want to diminish those things, but I know those are important and those are characteristics. But I have been in schools and seen groups of teachers congregate, and somebody's like, has anybody been looking at Susie lately? You know, the blonde hair, blue-eyed girl who shows up and now her hair is stringy and greasy. And so they're noticing that she's not washing her hair and she doesn't answer questions as much in class. And, you know, something must be going on at home. And let's rally, let's call, let's figure out whatever. And they have the next case file is Shaniqua, who is flipping over tables, cursing out teachers, who is skipping class. And it's like, yeah, we're gonna probably have to suspend her because she's just been a menace. You don't see us. I mean, this goes to all the things around adultification of Black girls, and they don't see our trauma. So we need more training all the way at the root, which I find the Yale School of Psychiatry is sort of the root where you get your training. It's important for the training to be more focused on the ways that trauma and survival show up in different communities, you know?
I will try to make that happen with what I possess. We'll be in touch in 6 months. I'm going to start taking questions from the audience now.
Okay.
And the first question we have is from Linda Lee Shako, and they ask, Ms. Burke, can you speak about Ms. Makia Bryant? What could the community do to help and prevent incidents like hers?
Yeah, Ma'Khia Bryant has been heavy on my heart for the last few days. And it's interesting that she's brought up in this context, because one of the things that stood out to me immediately that we haven't talked enough about, I haven't heard enough conversation about, is that she's in foster care.
Foster care, correct.
Right.
Trying to be reunited with her mother.
She's and we don't have the reasons yet, or I haven't heard the reasons why yet, why she's in foster care. But this incident happened at the foster home, right? And so where were the adults to intervene before the police were even called? And I keep thinking about what kind of experiences she was holding already at 16, right? Where has she been failed in other places before she was failed on the street, ultimately in her life that day? And so a lot of this to me is about wrapping ourselves around Black girls and community. It's always related to all of the stuff I was just saying. I've also seen, we talk about defunding police, but we should also be talking about defunding some of the systems that lead to the pipelines that lead to legal interactions for folks of color and Black people in particular. So, right, that means systems like foster care that have been used in ways to disrupt Black families for so long without providing the actual support that's needed. I think in the case of Ma'Khia, I suspect, I don't know this, obviously we don't have enough information, but I suspect that there were multiple systems that failed her before that day on the street. And so it goes to this thing that I'm always talking about, is that whether it's sexual violence, I say this specifically around sexual violence, but I think generally in our communities, we need multiple interventions. There's no singular solution, there's no silver bullet. We need multiple interventions. And I often refer to, it's way simplistic, but when you think, and for those of you who are old enough, if you think that 25 years ago, we were smoking in public, people were smoking on planes and in airports. A lot of y'all don't know that. It sounds foreign. My daughter's 23 and it's like, that sounds crazy. Because that's never.
I worked at the Olive Garden in the smoking section. Yeah.
Exactly, right? There used to be a smoking section inside. And in order for us to get from the Marlboro Man and the Virginia Slims lady on TV and big billboards and Virginia Slims ads and cool ads and Newports for Black people who like to smoke and play volleyball for whatever reason, in order for us to get from that to the point where young people in there, I forgot, what is this, the Y generation, the X generation, the young people who are young now, 20 something years old now, it's abnormal to them. But in order to get from there to here, we had to have multiple interventions. There were legal interventions, right? People sued tobacco companies and there were all kinds of lawsuits around tobacco companies. They sued to make sure that we couldn't have these advertisements on television. So there were cultural interventions. There were medical interventions, all the research that came out that secondhand smoke will kill you, and right? So there were interventions from these various directions that got us not that people don't smoke anymore, right? Because the tobacco industry is always reinventing. Now they want kids to vape. They're always reinventing themselves. So it's a constant fight. It's not that people don't smoke anymore. It's that I now have a 23-year-old who thinks smoke is disgusting. Where I grew up with candy cigarettes that made you pretend to smoke, right? And it was cool to do that. We shifted the narrative around cigarette smoking and the ideas around cigarette smoking so drastically because of multiple interventions. It is going to take that for us to save a Ma'Khia Bryant. It's going to take that for us to be in live in a society and live in this country where you don't look at a 250-pound, 16-year-old girl and think that she's a threat and an adult because she has a steak knife in her hand. Mm-hmm. And it's also going to take multiple interventions for us to get to a place where a 16-year-old girl, because now my understanding is that the two people that came to fight her were grown women, that these adults are not standing around, not intervening to support.
Their smartphone out recording it.
Yeah. Right, who are not intervening to support our young people, right? It's going to take firing on all cylinders to do that. And so I know that's not hyper specific, but it is sort of like from a 30,000 feet view, the kind of work that it's going to take.
So I'm going to ask one follow-up question by Dr. Matt Goldenberg, and hashtag he's in charge of the med student education. So what's up, Dr. Goldenberg? Hi, we can these questions in here. And he's asking, I'm interested in your experience and thoughts about engaging non-police state agencies like Department of Children and Families that are purportedly responsible for protecting children that have often have a legacy of discrimination. In the context, based on what you've also just said, is they've been separating Black families since slavery. It's part of the intentional strategies they use to keep us from providing. Take our spirit away, break us down, and we'll be much more docile. So separating Black families is a tactic centuries old. So to Dr. Goldenberg's question, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, we see it separating Black families. We're watching them separating children from at the border, right? This tactic of separating children from their family, it's one of the cruelest things that you can do, as opposed to supporting a family based on poverty. I found that this is very, very personal, but it's related. In doing my research, my family tree research, I found that my grandfather was taken from my great-grandmother's home, and the reason listed was indigence. And it's because she had it really was because she had two children by two different men, and the state deemed her incompetent. So they put my grandfather into a boys' home at 9 years old, because his mom could, as opposed to creating systems to support her, they took her child away. And I can trace the ramifications of that all the way to right now. So I have a lot of thoughts about that. And that's what I meant about, it's not just about defunding police. We have to upend some of these non-law enforcement, agencies and that exist, because they are doing nothing. They're nothing more than tearing families apart and not doing the job that they were employed to do. So I definitely think, as the conversation around defund gets bigger and bigger, that it should move into social services. And how do we reimagine services for our community that are culturally responsible, right? Not just competent. Like, competency is baseline. You need to be culturally responsible, culturally connected, right? Culturally invested in these communities in order to actually care about the outcome. Like, to your point earlier, you was talking about this, anti-racism is the order of the day. Everybody is talking about anti-racist this and that. But very few people are talking. We talk about, we see a Black life be snuffed out and Black people be killed with impunity. There's all this guilt and shame that the people come from, and they're like, well, I need to read a book. So all the Black people on bestseller lists, because they got racist and anti-racist in their title, and everybody rushes to read the anti-racist book so they can check a box and say, well, I did my thing. I did the right thing. But you see a Ma'Khia Bryant get killed, and you say, well, she had a knife. That's different, because you're not engaged with Black humanity. You don't really see us as human beings. You're anti-racist because you got a bunch of information and words, but you can't synthesize that information unless you are engaged with Black humanity. And so that has to be the difference here. You're not going to find that in a book, right? You're not going to find that in just some text or listening to somebody give a speech. You have to actively and intentionally be engaged, and not just Black humanity, but humanity. If you don't see them babies being taken from their parents at the border as a crime and a crisis, then you're really not engaged with humanity. If you can find a singular reason why that's okay, or why you can't lift your voice for that, then I don't want to hear about your anti-racist anything. I don't care what book you read. I don't care what seminar you took. I don't care if you heard me speak 17 times in a row. I don't believe you. And that's the difference that has to happen.
It's hard because, and I've spoken this in public spaces before, I feel like the more head knowledge we have, the more lectures we have, the harder it is to capture just inhumanity in the moment. And that fragility of, what do you mean I messed up? I read the book. We've got to move past that, because I'm so tired of hearing it. I'd rather take the banner down if we're going to continue the frackle knackle than confuse ourselves at frackle knackle.
I have a book that's coming out in 2 days, right? It's as I'm talking about not reading the book, but Brene Brown and I wrote this book, or co-edited this book. And when because I did it at her publishing, at Random House, which is, I'm under another publisher. When I was talking to the head of Random House, and he said to me, who is the audience for this book? And I said, Black people. This book is an offering to the Black community first. Doesn't mean other people shouldn't read it. I think people of all stripes should go out and read it. But what we just did in 2020 is we watched a Black man's life get snuffed out. We watched as a Black woman was killed in her sleep. We felt horrific about it. We took to the streets, we marched, we did all of these things. And all the white people said, Black people, please tell me how I can be better. What can I do to be better to you? How can I be more anti-racist? Before we could even take a breath and say, God damn it, that looks like my uncle. That looks like my niece. I can't hardly look at Makia Bryant because she looks literally like my niece.
They don't understand.
These are the
people, like, we love them. Like that could be my brother.
Exactly. Let me tell you something. This is my niece. This is my 14-year-old niece, right? Every time I look at Makia Bryant, I see this round face and this curly hair, and I have to deal with that trauma. I don't give a shit how anti-racist you are.
Correct.
When my same niece can walk outside and experience the same thing Makia Bryant saw. So our book is really an offering about Black humanity, a space for Black people to talk about what the shame as a tool of white supremacy and the shame resilience that it has taken for us to make it this far. And what vulnerability actually means to us. It doesn't mean the same thing it means to you. You can't tell me to just be vulnerable to have a better life, right? That was the conversation Brene and I were having. I'm like, you say vulnerability and you're talking about shopping in the store and feeling ashamed when your daughter's there and dancing together, right? That's a beautiful story. I'm talking about going in the store and being accused of being a shoplifter and probably being taken to jail and my whole life being changed because of one decision. And so we have to discuss what vulnerability actually means. I'm on a tangent now and I forgot what the original question was. So
we good. I'm gonna read one more comment and then we're gonna wrap up for the day. I feel like we could talk all year, but we got 45 minutes. We made it work though. Okay. So from the dynamic trainee here, Dr. Amanda Calhoun. Hello, Ms. Burke. Thank you for your work. As a Black female psychiatry training, I am wondering how I can better learn about sexual trauma in Black girls and work with folks like yourself who are doing the work. Do you have suggestions of people we can reach out to and learn from? We need your guidance in teaching.
Oh, bless you. I commend you for even doing that, for doing this work and wanting to focus in our communities. I think Dr. Black is probably a better guide for you in telling you, particularly for the area, right? I think that you should, if I was giving advice, I would say read books by Monique Morris, Dr. Monique Morris, who wrote the book Push Out. And she has dedicated her life to studying Black girls. You should read all the studies about the adultification of Black girls. And, there's a lot of information out there about that. Dr. Ruth Brown wrote a book some years ago, and Girlhood, is it Girlhood Interrupted? I can't remember, but her name is Dr. Ruth Brown. There's some really great information, literature out there written by Black women scholars. More Beautiful and More Terrible by Dr. Imani Perry, and Vexy Thing by Dr. Imani Perry. These are books that have been helped me understand who we are. I have sort of anecdotal information from being in the community and working with young people directly, which I also recommend. I think that once you put the books down, you got to get into the community, dig into your own lived experience, right? As a Black woman and a Black girl. But also your lived experience is going to be quite different from others, depending on where they are in the country and their socioeconomic status. So it would probably be helpful to get some lived experience with what the lives of Black girls in 2021 are very different than the lives of Black girls in 2010. So I think those things are really important. And I think that's important across the board. Whatever the community you feel connected to, even if you come from that community, you got to spend real time and try to get real understanding, and then marry that understanding to the academic information that you are getting to come up with something that also might not look like what you're learning in school, but you know that it's necessary and needed to better serve the people who you want to serve.
Tarana, thank you for today. I had so much fun. I'm like sitting here. I
See,
don't know if I'm ever going to do grand rounds again, but it was fun while it lasted. Thank you. We have over 800 people in our webinar right now.
Wow.
With more to come as we stream it on YouTube. So your truth was heard, and we'll be following up on what Yale needs to do for that teaching. Well, yeah.
Well, thank you. And I know there are a lot of questions that we didn't get, so I'm looking in the question box now. But I hope that some of the questions were answered in some of the other ones, and I appreciate, all of the attention. I appreciate people coming out and listening. And I want to say, I saw something in the comment box. I want to say, I speak a lot about Black children, Black people, Black community, but honestly, a lot of the information that I shared and a lot of the things we talked about really are across the board by every marginalized community. Communities that are pushed to the margins largely experience a lot of the similar things. And I think you can take and apply that to AAPI, Latinx, queer Black, like all of the different intersections. All of it is needed. We need people who sit at all kinds of different intersections. So I hope people hear that and can utilize it in that way.
Tarana and Dr. Black, thank you so much. Oh, can you see me? Am I like a ghost talking to you?
Yeah.
Like voice of God.
No, it's just a conference organizer. But thank you so much for all of this. This was such an amazing grand rounds. This might be the most honest, real grand rounds I've ever seen in my whole life. There was 800 people to bear witness to the truth that you both shared. So thank you so much. Also, just wanted to say, if you're more interested in hearing more about the types of topics that Tarana was talking about, there's a whole track about Black women's mental health. And there are tracks, multiple sessions on sexual assault and how we can better support survivors. So thank you all for coming. Also, just want to put a plug. We have also been able to give everybody digital gifts for people who attend the main sessions of the conference. So the gift for this session is a subscription to MoodFit, which is a wellness app. So I just wanted to put this up for people if you want to try this. And again, thank you so much for coming to the keynote.
Thank you so much for having me. This is wonderful. So good to meet both of you. Thank you. I'm sure we'll be cross paths someplace in the future.
I hope so.
I've been waiting an hour for that sip of coffee. Y'all don't even know. Okay, thanks.
Enjoy the rest of your weekend and the rest of the conference.
Thank you.